Imagine a world where kings woke each morning surrounded by gold and velvet, only to close their eyes at night as captives in dark, damp cells. Picture emperors whose words once commanded millions, now silenced and reduced to whispers in exile. History is filled with stories of rulers who seemed untouchable, whose dynasties stretched across centuries, yet whose power dissolved almost overnight. Their crowns did not protect them, their armies could not shield them, and their names, once spoken with awe, became reminders of fragility. When we look at the fall of great dynasties, the irony is as sharp as it is haunting. The Romanovs of Russia commanded one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, but by the year 1918, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were taken from their palace to a basement where they met their tragic end. The Habsburgs of Austria, who had for centuries built an empire through careful marriages and endless treaties, found their rule shattered by the forces of war and nationalism. Charles I, the last emperor, spent his final days in exile, far from the grandeur of Vienna. And in France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette saw the glittering halls of Versailles exchanged for the cold echo of prison walls, their lives cut short by the blade of revolution. These stories are more than the endings of royal families. They are warnings about the fragile nature of authority and the dangers of ignoring the tides of change. They remind us that no matter how solid a throne may appear, its survival depends on trust, adaptability, and the loyalty of those who live under it. When rulers fail to recognize the voices of their people, their crowns, no matter how dazzling, can vanish in an instant. But what makes these tales endure is not only the political upheaval. It is the human drama that played out behind the scenes. Families torn apart, children growing up in exile, desperate escape attempts, betrayals by once loyal allies. All of these moments show us the deeply personal cost of power lost. They transform kings and queens from distant figures into human beings caught in the grip of history. Even today, in the year 2025, we find ourselves drawn to these stories because they echo truths that remain unchanged. Power is fragile, ambition is dangerous, survival is uncertain, and betrayal often waits in the shadows. Monarchs may no longer hold sway over most of the world, but the lessons from their downfalls still resonate. They speak not only to leaders who wield authority today, but also to ordinary people who, in their own way, hold the power to change societies. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will journey through the dramatic ends of once mighty monarchies, exploring how rulers who seemed destined to reign forever found themselves dethroned, imprisoned, or exiled. Stay with us as we uncover the stories of grandeur and downfall, ambition and betrayal, and discover what their echoes mean for us today. A man who falls asleep on a throne, surrounded by courtiers, musicians, and guards, only to wake the next day stripped of his title, locked away in a chamber with barred windows, the crown he wore hours before now pressed on the head of another. History is filled with these jolting reversals, when monarchs who seemed unshakable in their authority were suddenly swept aside, sometimes by their own families, sometimes by ambitious rivals, and sometimes by the sudden shift of public will. The sight of power vanishing overnight has always carried a strange fascination. It shows us the fragility of human ambition, the speed with which fortune changes, and the precariousness of life lived at the highest summit of rule. Throughout the world, the rise and fall of dynasties has repeated itself with a rhythm that almost feels inevitable. The story is not only of empires, but also of individuals. Kings, sultans, emperors, and tsars who once commanded armies, dictated law, and bent the lives of millions to their decisions found themselves suddenly powerless, confined to prisons, palaces that became cages, or exile that turned their former grandeur into an echo. They carried the same question in their hearts. How could supreme command slip from their hands so quickly, as if it had never truly belonged to them? In the palaces of Constantinople, for centuries, the Byzantine emperors lived under the shadow of this very fear. A ruler could be acclaimed in the hippodrome, crowned with the golden diadem of the empire, and in the same year blinded and cast into a monastery by a rival faction. Power in that empire was gilded yet fragile. Consider Michael V, who rose to the throne in the 11th century after years of obscurity. His reign began with the promise of stability, yet within a year his people stormed the palace, furious at his policies. He sought sanctuary in a monastery, but the mob dragged him out and put out his eyes. A man who had been emperor was left blind and powerless, his gilded cage reduced to a dark cell. The Ottomans who succeeded the Byzantines inherited not only their city, but also the same truth of unstable rule. In the Topkapi Palace, princes grew up surrounded by unimaginable luxury, but also by the knowledge that they were being prepared for a destiny that could either crown them or kill them. Brothers of a new sultan were often strangled to ensure no rival claim could be made. One morning a young man might wake as heir to an empire stretching from Hungary to Arabia, only to be summoned hours later to the bowstring. The gilded cage was sometimes literal. Princes were confined in the so-called kafes, or cage, a suite of rooms in the palace where potential heirs lived in isolation, denied freedom and denied life beyond walls, their existence both protected and imprisoned. They were kings in waiting who might never rule, tasting the bitterness of power withheld and the constant threat of sudden death. Similar reversals played out far from the Bosporus. In France, during the convulsions of the Revolution, Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette lived through the most famous descent from majesty to captivity. They had once ruled from Versailles, a palace whose scale and splendor had no equal in Europe, a place where fountains, mirrors, and gilded halls displayed the very image of absolute monarchy. Yet within a few short years, they were forced from Versailles to Paris, confined under guard, and treated not as rulers but as criminals. Their power evaporated almost overnight as the old order gave way to a storm of revolutionary fervor. The king who had signed decrees and commanded armies found himself a prisoner, awaiting trial, and ultimately awaiting the guillotine. For the people who watched, the speed of this transformation was as shocking as it was symbolic. Russia too knew the sudden fall of rulers. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, embodied the imperial majesty of a dynasty that had ruled for more than 3 centuries. At the start of the 20th century, he commanded a realm that stretched across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. He lived in palaces adorned with gold, marble, and priceless art, and the aura of autocracy seemed almost divine. Yet within a matter of months, amid war, famine, and unrest, he was forced to abdicate. He and his family were taken into custody, shuttled between residences that became more like prisons, and finally executed in a basement in Ekaterinburg. The speed of their fall revealed not only the vulnerability of the monarch, but also the fragility of the system itself. One day they were a dynasty, the next they were captives, and soon after, they were corpses, their empire collapsing behind them. China's dynastic history provides another stark vision of the gilded cage. The last emperor, Puyi, ascended the throne of the Qing dynasty as a child, surrounded by courtiers who treated him as the son of heaven. His world was a palace of dragon motifs, red lacquered gates, and ritual bows. Yet even while he sat on the throne, decisions were made by others, and the empire was already crumbling under foreign pressure and internal weakness. In his teenage years, he was forced to abdicate, reduced from emperor to a mere title holder within the Forbidden City. He lived within the palace grounds as a private citizen, unable to rule, yet still bound to the trappings of an imperial identity. Later he became a puppet ruler under Japanese occupation, his crown a tool of foreign control. By the end of his life, he was an ordinary worker, a man who had once been an emperor, but now queued with common citizens. His journey showed the longest echo of the gilded cage: power without freedom, a crown that offered no protection, and a life that drifted into irrelevance. Even in England, where monarchy has survived in constitutional form, the fear of downfall haunted rulers. Richard II, in the late 14th century, believed in the divine right of kings and acted with a sense of untouchable authority. Yet his nobles turned against him, and his cousin Henry Bolingbroke deposed him. Richard was imprisoned, his once glittering court replaced by the cold walls of Pontefract Castle, where he eventually starved to death. The man who had worn the crown of England, who had been surrounded by ceremony and grandeur, ended his days as a prisoner, a stark image of how authority could collapse within months. These stories are not isolated. They repeat across continents and centuries, carrying the same pattern. The trappings of monarchy, gold, jewels, titles, rituals, and armies, suggest permanence and stability. Yet beneath the surface lies instability, plots, betrayals, and sudden turns of fortune. To be a king or an emperor was to live in constant awareness that friends could become enemies overnight, and that loyalty could be bought, sold, or broken in an instant. The gilded cage is not only the prison after the fall, but the throne itself, a place of beauty and danger, where every act is watched, every word is weighed, and every bond is fragile. The question that runs through all of these stories is clear. How could power so absolute vanish so suddenly? Was it weakness in the ruler, corruption in the system, or the unstoppable pressure of wider social change. And who were the men and women caught at the heart of these reversals? Those who experienced both the height of command and the depths of captivity. Their names, Michael, Louis, Nicholas, Poix, Richard, and countless others, tell us that no dynasty, however strong, was safe from the sudden transformation of king into captive. The story of the Romanovs, perhaps more than any other, illustrates how a dynasty that believed itself eternal could vanish in an instant. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of his line, inherited not only the vast empire of Russia, but also the heavy weight of absolute rule. He believed deeply in autocracy, holding to the conviction that the monarch was chosen by God and answerable to no mortal authority. For years, as pressure mounted from reformers, revolutionaries, and ordinary citizens crushed under the burdens of war and famine, he clung to that vision. His faith in the throne never wavered, yet it blinded him to the reality of a changing world. In the midst of the First World War, when the country was starving and armies were breaking, Nicholas still clutched the idea that divine right could stand against human desperation. The final collapse came swiftly. In the early months of 1917, he was forced to abdicate, and within a year he and his family were prisoners. They were shuffled from palace to house, each stage of confinement narrower, each guard less loyal. At last, in a dim cellar in Ekaterinburg, the dynasty ended with gunfire and bayonets. In one night, more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule came to a bloody close. A man who had once ruled 1/6 of the globe died as a captive, his daughters and son shot beside him, their bodies buried in secret. The fall of the Romanovs was not only a political event, but also a human tragedy, showing how quickly crowns dissolve when belief collides with reality. The same lesson had been written centuries earlier in France, when Louis XVI faced the wave of revolution. His story runs parallel to Nicholas's in many ways, for both men believed in their divine right, and both found themselves unable to bend with the winds of change. Louis reigned in a palace that symbolized absolute monarchy, the grand halls of Versailles echoing with the image of untouchable kingship. Yet outside those gilded gates, hunger and anger grew. Bread riots swelled into calls for reform, and reform swelled into revolution. Within only a few years, the Sun King's descendants who had basked in the glow of Versailles were dragged to Paris under guard. Louis and his queen became prisoners of their own people. At his trial, he tried to stand as a monarch, but the court treated him as a criminal. When the guillotine blade fell in 1793, the sound that followed was not only the end of a king, but also the end of a world that had seemed unchangeable. His queen followed him soon after. Their fall mirrored that of Nicholas. Power that seemed unbreakable vanished as if it had never existed. Further back in time, England had seen a similar reversal. Richard II, crowned as a boy, grew into a ruler convinced of his divine authority. He saw the crown not as a responsibility, but as an untouchable gift. Yet his arrogance bred resentment among his nobles. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke gathered enough support to overthrow him, and within months Richard's throne was gone. The man who had commanded lords and knights found himself locked away in Pontefract Castle, reduced to waiting for the end. There he starved to death, his once glittering court now only a memory. Centuries later, another English king, Charles I, met a fate closer to Louis. His refusal to share power with Parliament led to civil war. He believed until his last moment that a king was above judgment, yet he was tried and executed before a crowd in London. His death sent shockwaves through Europe. To see an anointed monarch beheaded by his own people was almost unthinkable, but it proved again that the crown offered no permanent protection. If Europe provides many examples of crowns lost, Asia shows equally striking reversals. In China, the young Emperor Poix experienced one of the most surreal descents from power. Crowned as a child in the Forbidden City, he sat upon the dragon throne as the Son of Heaven, yet his empire was already crumbling. He was forced to abdicate before he was even a teenager. For a time he lived in the Forbidden City stripped of authority, but still surrounded by ritual, a prisoner of his own past. Later, foreign powers used him as a puppet, installing him as Emperor of Manchukuo under Japanese control. His throne became a cage, a tool of others' ambition. By the end of his life, after the collapse of the Japanese Empire and his own capture, he worked as a gardener and then as a clerk, an ordinary man who had once been the Emperor of China. His life carried the full weight of irony, the Son of Heaven reduced to filling out paperwork in anonymity. In the Ottoman world, the fate of rulers was even more precarious. The system of succession often left multiple brothers as potential heirs. To prevent civil war, new sultans frequently ordered the execution of their siblings. Thus, the palace of Topkapi housed princes who lived in comfort yet under constant fear, confined in the so-called cage, a gilded prison where they waited to see if they would ascend the throne or meet death at the bowstring. Many princes spent decades in that limbo, their lives wasted in luxurious captivity, cut off from the world outside. Even the sultans themselves were not secure. Selim III was deposed by his own soldiers, imprisoned in his palace, and murdered. His successor, Mustafa IV, suffered the same fate not long after. The Ottoman story makes clear that the gilded cage was not only a metaphor, but a daily reality. To live within walls of marble and gold was also to live under the shadow of strangulation, banishment, or sudden downfall. In India, the Mughal dynasty offers another dramatic story of power unraveling. The emperors who once ruled from the Red Fort in Delhi commanded riches and armies that stunned the world. Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, left behind a vision of splendor. Yet by the 18th century, the dynasty weakened under internal divisions and external invasions. Bahadur Shah II, the last Mughal, lived more as a poet than a ruler when the uprising of 1857 broke out. Though rebels proclaimed him their emperor, the British crushed the revolt. Bahadur Shah was captured, tried, and exiled to Rangoon. He died far from the halls of Delhi, a prisoner in foreign hands. His grave was left unmarked, the dynasty erased with quiet finality. The man who had been the heir of Akbar and Shah Jahan ended his life as a forgotten exile, another monarch whose crown dissolved into dust. The pattern repeats again and again. In Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie was hailed as a divine figure, even worshipped as a messiah by followers abroad. He ruled for decades, carrying himself with dignity and ceremony. Yet famine, unrest, and discontent grew. In 1974, he was deposed by a coup. The emperor who had been greeted with reverence by world leaders was placed under house arrest, cut off from the world, and eventually killed. The image of him being lifted into a car by soldiers, frail and bewildered, contrasted sharply with the vision of imperial majesty that had defined his reign. His crown, like so many before, proved no shield against the shifting tide of history. Japan, too, holds a unique example, for its emperors were long seen as divine, beyond the reach of ordinary fate. Yet even there, the Second World War forced an unprecedented reversal. Emperor Hirohito, once worshipped as a living god, had to stand before his people and renounce his divinity in 1946. Though he remained on the throne, the transformation was profound. The man who had been viewed as the descendant of the sun goddess now spoke as a mortal, his power curtailed, his role reduced to a symbol. His cage was not one of stone but of symbolism, a reminder that even the most sacred crowns can be stripped of their meaning overnight. When we look across these stories, the Romanovs in their cellar, Louis at the guillotine, Richard starving in his castle, Puyi in his garden, Selim strangled in his chamber, Bahadur Shah in his exile, Haile Selassie in his house arrest, Hirohito surrendering his divinity, we see one unbroken thread. The crown is heavy not only because of the responsibility it carries, but also because of the fragility it conceals. To rule is to live in a gilded cage where the bars are not always visible until they close in. The grandeur of monarchy can vanish in a night, and the faces of those who once seemed untouchable are revealed as mortal, fallible, and subject to the same whims of fate as any other person. What unites these figures is not only their downfall but the speed of it. The Romanovs went from imperial palaces to a cellar in little more than a year. Louis went from Versailles to execution in less than half a decade. Richard went from throne to dungeon within a season. Puyi moved from emperor to exile while still a child. Bahadur Shah was declared emperor 1 month and a prisoner the next. Time after time, crowns that seemed eternal crumbled in moments. This is the mystery that haunts the history of power. How can something so great disappear so quickly? The answer lies in the fragile foundation beneath the gold. Authority rests not only on ritual, tradition, and divine right, but also on the loyalty of soldiers, the support of nobles, the patience of subjects, and the accidents of history. When any of these pillars fail, even the mightiest throne becomes an empty chair. The gilded cage is therefore not only a symbol of captivity after the fall, but of kingship itself. The monarch is bound by expectations, trapped by the very rituals that exalt him, surrounded by luxury that isolates as much as it protects. And when the cage breaks, the fall is sudden, total and merciless. In every century, across every land, crowns have unraveled, dynasties have been dethroned, and rulers have discovered that the throne is as fragile as glass. Their stories remind us that no power is absolute, no rule eternal, and that even the brightest crown can vanish into shadow overnight. Among the great dynasties that seemed immovable, none carried the weight of centuries quite like the Habsburgs. For generation after generation, their empire had stretched across Central Europe, binding together dozens of peoples, languages, and traditions under one crown. Their palaces in Vienna echoed with the sound of orchestras, their court dazzled with ceremony, and their dynasty had survived wars, treaties, and the shifting balance of European power. Yet even for the Habsburgs, the gilded cage of monarchy proved fragile when confronted with the forces of the modern world. Emperor Charles I, who took the throne in the last years of the Great War, discovered this truth in the harshest way possible. Charles had not been expected to rule so soon. The throne passed to him after the death of his great-uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, who had reigned for nearly 70 years. The old emperor was the very image of continuity, a figure who seemed eternal, a symbol of the empire itself. When Franz Joseph died in 1916, many believed that the dynasty could continue with Charles, young, energetic, and eager to reform. He came to power with a sense of duty and a genuine desire to bring peace. Yet his empire was already crumbling beneath him. The First World War had stretched its resources to the breaking point, and within the diverse lands of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, nationalist movements stirred restlessly. Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Poles, and Italians each dreamed of their own future, and the empire that had bound them together for centuries was beginning to split at the seams. Charles tried desperately to hold it together. Unlike some monarchs who clung blindly to tradition, he sought compromise. He recognized that the empire could no longer survive as it had, with Vienna at the center commanding obedience from distant provinces. He envisioned a new structure, a federation of equal nations under one crown, where loyalty might be preserved by granting autonomy and dignity. He also pursued peace, secretly reaching out to the Allies, hoping to end the war before it destroyed everything. But his efforts came too late. The armies of Austria-Hungary were exhausted, the people were starving, and the Allies saw no reason to negotiate with a dynasty that they believed was already finished. As the war dragged toward its end, Charles faced a nightmare familiar to monarchs across history. Authority that had once seemed unshakable slipped from his grasp day by day. Soldiers deserted, ministers resigned, and nationalist leaders proclaimed independence. In the autumn of 1918, as the war collapsed, the empire began to dissolve before his eyes. Czechoslovakia declared its birth, Hungary broke away, South Slavic lands proclaimed a new kingdom, and Poland re-emerged from partition. Vienna itself filled with demonstrations, the population weary of war and distrustful of their monarch. Charles refused to abdicate, believing that the crown was not his to give up, but rather a sacred trust. He declared only that he would relinquish participation in government, a careful phrasing that left open the hope of restoration. Yet his words mattered little. The dynasty was finished, its centuries of rule reduced to memory almost overnight. In November of 1918, as armistice bells rang across Europe, Charles and his family withdrew from Vienna to their palace in Schönbrunn, once the symbol of imperial majesty, now a gilded cage of confinement. From there, exile followed swiftly. In March of 1919, the new Republican government ordered Charles to leave Austria. He and his family were forced into departure, stripped of authority, wealth, and status. They traveled to Switzerland, where the former emperor lived not as ruler of millions, but as a displaced man, dependent on the goodwill of others. Later he would attempt to reclaim the Hungarian throne, making two failed efforts in 1921, but both were thwarted, and his dreams of restoration died with him. Ill and weakened, he spent his final days on the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he died in 1922 at the age of only 34. The man who had once worn the crown of the Habsburgs, heir to one of Europe's greatest dynasties, passed away in poverty, surrounded only by his family. The story of Charles I fits seamlessly into the long chain of unraveling crowns. Like Nicholas II, he believed in the sanctity of monarchy, though he was more willing to compromise. Like Louis XVI, he faced the impossible weight of revolutionary change. Like Bahadur Shah of India, he saw his realm fracture into pieces around him. And like so many others, he discovered that the cage of monarchy is not only gilded but also fragile, cracking under the strain of forces no ruler can control. The Habsburgs had reigned for centuries, shaping Europe through war and marriage. Yet in a matter of months their empire dissolved, and their ruler became a wandering exile. The fall of Charles I shows us that dynasties, however ancient, are subject to the same swift reversals as individual monarchs. A crown may carry centuries of history, but it can still vanish overnight. The Habsburg story reminds us again that no matter how grand the palace or how deep the lineage, power built on human structures is never eternal. It survives only as long as people believe in it, and when belief crumbles, the empire collapses with it. Charles learned this truth in the silence of exile, his crown reduced to memory, his empire dissolved into nations that no longer bowed to Vienna. In him, the theme of the gilded cage reached another chapter, showing that even the longest dynasties can be dethroned, and even the grandest crowns can unravel into nothing more than a story told by history. When the Bourbon dynasty stood at the height of its splendor, few could imagine that its throne would one day become a scaffold. The very notion seemed absurd in a kingdom where the monarchy had been celebrated for centuries as the natural and divinely sanctioned order of life. Versailles itself embodied this image. With its endless halls of mirrors, gardens stretching beyond sight, fountains leaping into the air at command, and gilded apartments filled with courtiers bowing at every turn, it represented the supreme vision of absolute power. The Bourbons had shaped themselves not merely as rulers, but as symbols of stability and grandeur, the anchor of France. Yet, as with so many dynasties before and after, the gilded palace concealed fractures, and those cracks widened fatally under Louis XVI. Louis ascended the throne in 1774 at only 19 years old, after the death of his grandfather Louis XV. He was young, awkward, and inexperienced, with little of the commanding presence his position demanded. Though he carried a sense of duty, he lacked confidence in his own decisions. Even in the early years of his reign, courtiers noted his hesitancy, his tendency to delay, and his reliance on advisors who often disagreed with one another. Beside him stood Marie Antoinette, daughter of the formidable Maria Theresa of Austria, who arrived in France as a teenager to seal the Bourbon-Habsburg alliance. She became a lightning rod for criticism almost from the start, accused of frivolity, extravagance, and foreign sympathies, though in truth she was more scapegoat than architect of decline. Together, the king and queen stood at the heart of a monarchy glittering on the surface, but already facing storms from within. The greatest challenge lay in finance. The Kingdom of France, for all its size and wealth, was staggering under debt, much of it inherited from previous reigns and worsened by costly wars. The 7 Years' War had drained the treasury, and the American War of Independence, undertaken to weaken Britain, only multiplied the burden. By the early 1780s, the crown faced near bankruptcy. Ministers such as Turgot, Necker, and Calonne offered plans for reform, ranging from new taxes on the privileged estates to sweeping modernization of administration. Yet every proposal ran into resistance. The nobility and clergy, who enjoyed exemptions, refused to yield their privileges. The parliaments, regional courts dominated by nobles, blocked measures in the name of defending tradition. And the king himself wavered, unwilling to enforce reforms against entrenched opposition, fearful of alienating the elite whose support he still relied upon. This indecision was fatal. Instead of imposing a clear course, Louis vacillated, dismissing one minister after another. Each failure deepened the crisis, and each dismissal weakened confidence in the crown. By 1788 the situation was so dire that he agreed to summon the Estates General, an assembly that had not met for over a century and a half. What was intended as a desperate measure to raise funds became the spark of revolution. Representatives of the Third Estate, frustrated by their marginalization, declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to speak for the nation itself. When they took the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until a constitution was established, the political ground beneath the monarchy began to tremble. Louis's response reflected the same blend of hesitation and misplaced confidence that had marked his rule from the beginning. At times he appeared willing to compromise, inviting reforms and promising change. At other moments he relied on military force, bringing troops near Paris, which only inflamed suspicions. When the Bastille fell on July 14, 1789, it became clear that events had outpaced him. The king had not ordered the storming, yet his indecision created the atmosphere in which it became possible. The image of Parisian crowds tearing down the symbol of royal authority echoed across the kingdom and the world. The monarchy's aura of invulnerability was gone. Over the next 2 years, Louis tried to adapt to constitutional monarchy, but he never fully accepted it. His instinct, rooted in centuries of Bourbon absolutism, was to resist the erosion of his power. He swore loyalty to the new order, yet in private he dreamed of restoring the old. His queen urged firmness, convinced that yielding would destroy the throne altogether. In June 1791, the royal family attempted to flee Paris in the infamous flight to Varennes, hoping to reach loyal troops and perhaps foreign allies. The escape failed. Captured and returned under guard, Louis was humiliated. More than any other act, this shattered the fragile trust between king and people. No longer could he be seen as a monarch willing to reform. He was now branded a traitor to the revolution. From that moment, the downward spiral quickened. As the revolution radicalized, as political clubs debated and the streets of Paris filled with voices demanding more than reform, the king became the focal point of suspicion and anger. Foreign powers threatened invasion to restore him, and revolutionaries suspected him of conspiring with them. When war broke out with Austria and Prussia in 1792, suspicion hardened into certainty. To many, Louis was not the father of the nation, but its enemy within. On August 10, 1792, crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family had been held under watch. Guards were massacred, and the monarchy was suspended. The king, queen, and their children were placed in the Temple prison. Louis, once master of Versailles, commander of armies, and symbol of French sovereignty, now lived behind bars, dependent on the mercy of jailers. His gilded cage was gone. His prison was of stone. The trial that followed sealed his fate. The new republic charged him not only with betrayal, but with crimes against liberty itself. Louis appeared before the convention, calm and dignified, asserting his innocence and claiming he had always acted for the good of his people. But his words could not undo years of suspicion, the failed flight, the evidence of secret correspondence with foreign monarchs, and the sense that he had never truly embraced reform. The verdict was inevitable, guilty. On January 21, 1793, Louis was led to the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution. Crowds filled the square, silent at first, watching as the king mounted the steps. He tried to speak, to declare himself innocent, to forgive those who condemned him, but the drums rolled to drown his words. The guillotine blade fell, and with it the Bourbon monarchy was severed from the body of France. The cheers that followed carried both triumph and terror, for with the king's death, the old order was not only challenged but destroyed. The execution of Louis XVI marked a moment of rupture not just for France, but for the entire world. It announced that monarchy, once seen as eternal, could be ended by the will of the people. It echoed the fate of Charles I in England a century earlier, but this time it reverberated with greater force, fueled by revolutionary ideals. Other monarchs watched in horror, understanding that the same fate might await them if their own subjects grew restless. For the Bourbons, it was the most shocking reversal imaginable. From the opulence of Versailles to the cold stone of the Temple, from the throne of a great kingdom to the guillotine's block. Louis's indecision, his failure to embrace reform when he had the chance, and his resistance born of absolutist tradition all paved the way for this outcome. Had he acted more decisively, perhaps by imposing reforms before the crisis reached breaking point, the monarchy might have been preserved in some form. But history rarely grants such ifs. Instead, his hesitation became the fatal flaw, the crack through which revolution poured. Marie Antoinette would follow him to the guillotine in October of the same year. The queen who had once been adorned with diamonds and pearls, whose every gesture had been copied by courtiers, stood in plain dress before her executioners, accused of crimes both real and invented. Her death, like her husband's, symbolized the complete collapse of Bourbon authority. The Bourbon story illustrates again the central theme of unraveling crowns. Power that seemed unshakable dissolved in months. Palaces became prisons. Kings became defendants. Queens became scapegoats. Centuries of tradition ended with the fall of a blade. The monarchy, which had once appeared eternal, was reduced to memory, leaving behind the question that haunts every dynasty. How could it vanish so quickly? For the Bourbons, the answer lies not only in external forces, but in the character of their king. Louis XVI was not a tyrant, not a monster, not even particularly ambitious. He was, in many ways, a decent man trapped in an impossible role, bound by expectations he could not meet. His indecision, his inability to choose between reform and resistance, left him standing still while events rushed forward. In that paralysis lay the doom of his dynasty. The Bourbon collapse, when placed beside the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the Mughals, and so many others, reminds us that monarchy is always a gilded cage, dazzling in its splendor yet brittle in its foundations. Once cracks appear, collapse can be sudden and merciless. Louis XVI, with his crown slipping from his hesitant grasp, embodies the fragility of power. He went to sleep as a king, and he awoke as a prisoner, until the day he stood beneath the blade, another sovereign whose crown had unraveled into dust. The fall from a throne to a prison cell has always carried a special weight, for it is not simply the loss of power, but the complete inversion of existence. A monarch spends years, often an entire lifetime, surrounded by deference, ceremony, and abundance. Meals are banquets, rooms are gilded, and every command is obeyed before it is even spoken. To be suddenly thrown into confinement, stripped of ceremony, left with coarse food, harsh walls, and indifferent guards, is more than a change of condition. It is the collapse of identity itself. The reality of royal imprisonment is one of the most striking contrasts in history, a reminder that the cage, once gilded, could at any moment become iron. The daily life of a captive monarch was marked above all by deprivation. In Versailles, Louis XVI had dined on delicacies prepared by the finest chefs of France, meals accompanied by music and served on gleaming silver. In the Temple prison, by contrast, his meals were meager rations of bread, broth, and thin wine, delivered not by courtiers but by jailers. He rose not to the sound of courtiers opening the curtains and bowing, but to the clank of keys and the orders of guards. His clothes, once embroidered with gold thread, gave way to plain wool. The vast gardens of Versailles, where fountains leapt on command, were replaced by a small, enclosed courtyard with bare walls, where he could walk only under watch. The contrast was a humiliation as much as a hardship. For a king, the reduction of space, food, and ceremony was not simply a physical burden, but a psychological wound, stripping away the symbols that defined him. The Romanovs endured the same descent. In their palaces, their meals had been lavish, their tables set with crystal and fine porcelain. As prisoners, they ate black bread, cabbage soup, and weak tea. Their clothes grew worn, their rooms damp and bare. The grandeur of their lives was reduced to the routine of confinement. Each day was marked by inspections, by guards counting them, by endless sameness. The children, who had once played in gardens and grand halls, now spent hours in small rooms, reading what books they could find, drawing, or whispering to one another under the eyes of soldiers. Their toys, once abundant, were taken away. Their jewels were confiscated. Even their writing was monitored. For Nicholas and Alexandra, the pain of confinement was magnified by the suffering of their son, the hemophiliac heir who needed special care and who was now denied proper treatment. Disease crept easily into the damp, crowded rooms, and each cough or fever became a source of dread. The Ottomans had institutionalized a form of royal imprisonment long before the fall. In the caves of the Topkapi Palace, princes lived for years in gilded rooms, cut off from the outside world, waiting to see if they would be called to the throne or strangled in the night. Daily life in the cage was defined by boredom and fear. Meals were regular but tasteless, designed to sustain but not to delight. The rooms were richly decorated, yet their very richness became oppressive when viewed every day without freedom. Guards watched every movement, conversations were monitored, and any attempt to reach beyond the walls was futile. Over time, isolation wore down the minds of the captives. Some princes fell into deep melancholy, others into madness, their spirits broken long before death came. The cage showed that imprisonment was not always bare walls and iron bars. Sometimes it was velvet curtains and marble floors that became suffocating in their confinement. The psychological toll of imprisonment often outweighed the physical. Monarchs who had been accustomed to command found themselves powerless, forced to ask permission for the smallest things, dependent on the goodwill of guards who once would not have dared look them in the eye. Isolation gnawed at them. Letters were censored, visitors restricted, conversations limited. Silence became their companion. For Marie Antoinette, imprisoned after the fall of the monarchy, the worst torment was not hunger or cold, but the loss of her children, taken from her to be raised by strangers. Alone in her cell, she aged rapidly, her hair turning white within months, her health deteriorating from grief. She had once been accused of frivolity and extravagance. In prison, she lived in threadbare clothes and wrote prayers on scraps of paper. Some prisoners clung to rituals as a way of preserving dignity. Louis XVI insisted on maintaining a schedule of prayer and reading, even when stripped of power. Nicholas II kept a diary, recording small details of his days, as if order on paper could give meaning to the formlessness of captivity. Others sank into despair, staring for hours at the walls, losing the will to speak. For them, the sudden loss of status was not simply political but existential. If one has lived as a sovereign, what is left when sovereignty is gone? The mind, once engaged in affairs of state, withers in confinement, turning inward, gnawing at regrets, replaying decisions that cannot be undone. Yet imprisonment did not always mean passivity. Desperate measures were often attempted, even when the odds were hopeless. The French royal family's flight to Varennes was the most famous escape attempt, but even after their capture, schemes abounded. Loyalists whispered through prison walls, smuggled messages, bribed guards. Marie Antoinette received letters hidden in baskets of laundry or sewn into clothing, though many were intercepted. Plans were made to rescue her, to storm the prison, to disguise her as a servant and spirit her away. Each failed, tightening the chain around her. In Russia, monarchist supporters plotted to free the Romanovs, but the chaos of revolution, the distrust of guards, and the advance of the Red Army doomed their efforts. For Nicholas and his family, the possibility of escape lingered like a cruel hope, but it never became reality. Loyalty in the shadows was a double-edged sword. Some guards, moved by pity or lingering respect, treated their prisoners with a measure of kindness, bringing small comforts or turning a blind eye to minor liberties. Others saw loyalty as betrayal, and any hint of sympathy could lead to punishment. Imprisoned royals lived in a haze of uncertainty, never knowing if the guard before them was friend or foe, never sure if kindness was genuine or a trap. Their fate often depended on these men, ordinary soldiers whose decisions could mean comfort or cruelty, life or death. The conditions of imprisonment varied across time and place, yet the essence remained the same: the stripping away of identity. The Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II, exiled after the uprising of 1857, was kept under close watch in Rangoon. He lived in a small house, his movements restricted, his food plain, his status reduced to irrelevance. For a man who had once ruled from the Red Fort of Delhi, surrounded by poets, musicians, and nobles, the change was devastating. He wrote verses of sorrow, mourning not only his lost throne but the humiliation of captivity. His words captured the bitterness of a monarch turned into a powerless old man, watched by guards, far from his land. In Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie endured house arrest in his final years. The emperor who had been hailed as a messiah abroad found himself confined in his palace, stripped of authority, his every movement monitored. The grand halls that had once echoed with ceremony became his prison. Disease weakened him, loneliness enveloped him, and he died in confinement, the glory of his reign erased by the silence of captivity. These stories of royal imprisonment reveal not only the fall of dynasties, but the human cost of downfall. Monarchs were not simply removed from power, they were reduced to shadows of themselves, made to live in spaces that denied their identity, forced to confront the fragility of their existence. Their daily lives became exercises in endurance, their minds battlegrounds between hope and despair. The grandeur of their past made their present all the more unbearable. To eat coarse bread after years of banquets, to sleep on straw after silken sheets, to bow to guards after being bowed to by nations. These reversals cut deeper than any blade. And yet, within the prisons, there remained flickers of dignity. Some accepted their fate with grace, leaving behind diaries, poems, or prayers that testify to their endurance. Others clung to faith, believing that suffering had meaning, that history would judge them more kindly than their jailers. Their stories remind us that behind the collapse of dynasties lay individuals, human beings who bore the weight of imprisonment not only in their bodies but in their souls. From Versailles to the Temple, from the Winter Palace to Ekaterinburg, from Topkapi's cage to Rangoon's exile house, the reality of royal imprisonment tells one unbroken tale: that the fall of crowns does not end at abdication or execution, but in the long days and nights of confinement, where monarchs learned what it meant to live without freedom. Their palaces became memories, their courts dissolved, and their crowns mere echoes. What remained was the cell, the guard, the ration, the silence. And in that silence, the truth of power revealed itself, not as eternal, not as divine, but as fragile as the lives of those who once wore it. The collapse of monarchies did not simply end the lives of sovereigns or cast them into prison or exile. It reshaped the very fabric of nations and altered the way the modern world understood government, identity, and authority. When the crowns of Europe fell, they left behind legacies that extended far beyond the chambers where abdications were signed or the cells where kings and queens faced judgment. The disappearance of these dynasties created a permanent shift in political structures, set the stage for new forms of governance, and forced peoples to redefine who they were without the monarch who had once stood as the symbol of the nation. The echoes of those changes can still be felt in the present, where the descendants of emperors, kings, and sultans live lives of diminished power, yet their names still carry the weight of history. In the case of Russia, the execution of Nicholas II and his family in 1918 did more than extinguish a bloodline that had ruled for over 3 centuries. It severed the tie between the Russian people and a monarchy that had been, for many, synonymous with national identity. The Romanov dynasty had embodied autocracy, orthodoxy, and Russian expansion. With its fall, Russia did not simply replace one ruler with another. It tore apart the very foundation of its political life. The Bolshevik regime built its legitimacy on the repudiation of monarchy, portraying the Tsarist system as a relic of oppression, waste, and inequality. The Soviet Union emerged as not only a new government, but as an experiment that rejected the very idea of hereditary rule. The monarchy had been buried not just physically in the cellar of Ekaterinburg, but ideologically in the speeches, policies, and symbols of the new state. Yet the absence of the monarchy left a void in identity that lingered beneath the surface. For generations, Russians were told to view the Romanovs as tyrants, yet memories persisted, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, old questions resurfaced. The remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and some of their children were buried in St. Petersburg with state ceremony in 1998, attended by both government officials and members of the surviving Romanov family. The canonization of the last Tsar and his family by the Russian Orthodox Church added a spiritual dimension to their legacy, transforming them from fallen monarchs into martyrs. Today, although no Romanov sits on a throne, the family's name remains part of national discourse, invoked in debates about tradition, morality, and Russian history. The monarchy's fall created a republic and later a superpower, but its legacy continues to stir questions about authority and continuity. In Austria, the fate of the Habsburg dynasty mirrored the disintegration of the empire itself. Charles I's departure in 1919 ended a reign that had lasted for centuries, and with it the notion of a vast, multi-ethnic monarchy holding Central Europe together. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire redrew the map of the continent, giving rise to new nation-states such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, while Hungary itself was reduced in size and power. Austria, once the center of imperial grandeur, became a small republic, struggling to define its identity after centuries of imperial dominance. The fall of the Habsburgs did not simply remove a family. It dismantled a political system that had managed a fragile balance among diverse peoples. Without that imperial structure, national identities were free to assert themselves, but this freedom also fueled tensions, rivalries, and conflicts that shaped the 20th century. For the Habsburg descendants, the loss of empire meant exile and transformation. Charles I died young in Madeira, leaving his widow Zita to wander through the years as a symbol of lost monarchy. Their children grew up in a Europe that no longer revered their family's authority, but still recognized their name. Otto von Habsburg, the eldest son, became an influential voice in European politics, not as an emperor, but as a member of the European Parliament. He argued for unity, integration, and reconciliation after the devastation of the Second World War, showing how a dynasty stripped of its throne could still influence the continent through ideas rather than crowns. The Habsburg name, once tied to palaces and armies, became linked to the project of a united Europe. In Austria itself, laws long barred members of the dynasty from holding office, yet the memory of their rule lingered in the architecture of Vienna, in the music of court composers, and in the history lessons that told of empire and fall. France had already transformed earlier, with the execution of Louis XVI in 1793 marking the definitive end of the Ancien regime. Yet even there, the monarchy's loss reshaped national identity in ways that still endure. The revolution did not only bring down a king, it redefined what it meant to be French. Instead of loyalty to crown and church, the new republic proclaimed loyalty to the nation, to liberty, equality, and fraternity. That shift created a model that inspired other revolutions across Europe and beyond, embedding the idea that sovereignty belonged not to dynasties but to people. The monarchy would return in France in various forms during the 19th century, but each restoration was fragile, each king or emperor haunted by the precedent of revolution. The guillotine that ended the life of Louis XVI also ended the unquestioned authority of kings in France forever. The Bourbon descendants lived with this duality, stripped of power, yet still symbols. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, various claimants asserted their right to the French throne, dividing themselves into legitimists who supported the line of Charles X and Orleanists who favored the descendants of Louis Philippe. These rivalries played out in exile, in manifestos, in drawing rooms, and in occasional returns to France under changing regimes. Today, Bourbon claimants still exist, though their influence is cultural rather than political. They appear at royal gatherings, charity events, or in historical discussions, their presence reminding France of a past it both rejects and romanticizes. For the French Republic, the monarchy's loss was a foundation stone, yet for many French citizens, the image of Versailles, the memory of kings and queens, remains part of their cultural identity. The fall of monarchies in the early 20th century reshaped international relations as well. Where once kings and emperors had ruled by divine right, the New World Order increasingly turned to republics, parliaments, and ideologies. The First World War was the great breaker of crowns. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans in Turkey had all been swept aside. These were not minor dynasties but pillars of European and Middle Eastern politics, families that had directed wars and treaties for centuries. Their disappearance created a vacuum filled by fragile republics, ambitious dictators, and shifting alliances. The permanence of monarchy had given way to the volatility of modern politics. The Ottoman case shows another side of the legacy of loss. The sultans had ruled from Constantinople since the 15th century, commanding an empire that stretched across 3 continents. By the early 20th century, the empire was already shrinking, but it was the aftermath of the First World War that sealed its fate. Sultan Mehmed VI was deposed, and by 1924, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk abolished the caliphate altogether. The descendants of the sultans were sent into exile, scattered across the globe. Some lived in obscurity, others found modest success in business or academia, but none reclaimed power. Yet the memory of Ottoman rule continues to shape Turkey's identity, with debates over secularism and tradition often invoking the empire's past. The descendants of the sultans occasionally resurface in news or cultural events, their lineage recognized but their authority gone. Across the globe, the legacy of dethroned monarchies raises the question of what becomes of royal descendants in a world where crowns no longer command obedience. For some families, exile meant poverty and obscurity. Members of the Romanov family lived scattered across Europe, many taking ordinary jobs, marrying outside royalty, or fading from public attention. For others, their names remained powerful symbols, attracting monarchists, historians, and romantics. In some cases, dynasties reinvented themselves, transforming from rulers into cultural figures, philanthropists, or politicians. The psychological weight of being a descendant of a lost dynasty is unique. To carry a name like Romanov, Habsburg, Bourbon, or Osman is to bear both pride and burden. Pride in the centuries of history, culture, and achievement associated with the family, but burden in the knowledge that the throne is gone, the empire dissolved, and the world has moved on. Some descendants have embraced that burden, speaking openly about history, attending ceremonies, and representing tradition. Others have chosen anonymity, preferring to live as private individuals, distanced from a past that can feel like both heritage and shadow. What is striking is that even in the modern age, long after the political power of monarchies has faded, the fascination with these dynasties persists. Royal weddings, funerals, and anniversaries attract attention. Palaces and castles become museums filled with visitors. Television and literature romanticize the lives and downfalls of kings and queens. The world may have moved into the age of republics and democracies, yet the memory of monarchy still stirs imagination. The descendants, even without crowns, embody that memory, their very existence a link between past and present. The legacies of these losses also shape how nations understand themselves. Russia without a czar, Austria without an empire, France without a king. Each of these identities was forged in the crucible of loss. In the absence of monarchs, people redefined loyalty, citizenship, and belonging. Republics rose, ideologies clashed, wars were fought, and new symbols replaced old crowns. Yet the fall of the monarchies was not only an end, but also a beginning. It forced nations to confront who they were and who they wished to become. And in that confrontation, the modern political world was born. The descendants of dethroned dynasties may no longer command armies or sign decrees, but they continue to influence through memory, through culture, and through the enduring fascination with the idea of monarchy. Their presence reminds us that history is not only written in books but carried in families, in names, in traditions that survive even when thrones fall. They are living legacies of loss, inheritors of crowns that exist only in memory, yet still capable of shaping how we view the past and how we imagine the connection between power and identity. In the end, the fall of monarchies was both destruction and creation. It destroyed dynasties that had ruled for centuries, stripping away crowns, palaces, and authority. But it created new nations, new identities, and new forms of politics that continue to define our world. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Ottomans, all lost their thrones, yet their stories remain central to the way we understand history. Their legacies of loss remind us that power is never permanent, that authority rests on belief, and that when belief shatters, even the mightiest crowns can crumble. What became of their world is still with us, not in thrones or decrees, but in the nations we know today, in the struggles for identity and authority that continue, and in the lives of descendants who walk among us as reminders that once, not so long ago, their families shaped the destinies of millions. The fall of monarchs, though it often unfolded in palaces and battlefields far removed from ordinary life, carries lessons that remain timeless. When one reflects on the fate of dynasties that once seemed immovable, it becomes clear that power, however ancient and deeply entrenched, is never beyond the reach of collapse. The great royal houses that shaped continents believed themselves ordained to rule, their authority reinforced by tradition, ritual, and sometimes the conviction that heaven itself had placed crowns upon their heads. Yet history shows again and again that even institutions that survived for hundreds or even thousands of years can vanish in an instant when faced with war, revolution, or the rising demands of societies no longer willing to be subjects. The fragility of power is perhaps the most enduring lesson from the downfall of kings. Consider the Romanovs, who had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. Their empire spanned 11 time zones, their armies counted in millions, and their palaces dazzled visitors with opulence. Yet in the course of only a few months during the First World War and the revolutions that followed, Nicholas II was forced from the throne, confined, and eventually executed with his family in a basement. All the trappings of power, the uniforms, the armies, the rituals of court, proved powerless against hunger, discontent, and the demand for change. The lesson is stark. No matter how long an institution endures, no matter how deep its roots, its survival depends on the faith of the people it governs. Once that faith collapses, even the most gilded throne cannot protect its occupant. The same was true for the Habsburgs. For centuries, they had built their empire not only with armies but with marriages, weaving together the crowns of Europe until their reach stretched across Central Europe, Spain, and even the New World. Their dynasty survived wars, plagues, and political upheavals. Yet when Charles I inherited the throne during the First World War, the weight of centuries could not save him. Within 2 years of his accession, his empire disintegrated. Nations that had been bound together under Vienna's command declared independence, and Charles was sent into exile. His reign is a reminder that history does not measure time by dynastic centuries, but by the will of peoples, and when nations decide to break free, even the most venerable institutions shatter like glass. The Bourbon tragedy in France underscores another dimension of fragility. Louis XVI inherited not just a throne but the accumulated traditions of the Ancien regime, a system that had guided France for generations. Yet his indecision, coupled with a society hungry for change, brought down the monarchy. The execution of the king in 1793 shocked Europe, showing that the divine right of kings could be nullified by the will of the people. In a single moment, the idea of unassailable monarchy gave way to the conviction that sovereignty belonged to citizens. The guillotine blade did more than end a life. It cut through the illusions of permanence. These examples reveal a truth that continues to echo into the present. Power is not a possession, it is a relationship. Monarchs were powerful because their subjects recognized them as such, because armies obeyed, and because tradition reinforced their authority. Once that recognition faltered, once soldiers deserted or peasants revolted, the entire structure collapsed. That fragility is not confined to monarchies alone. Even in the modern age, leaders who appear untouchable can find themselves swept aside when legitimacy evaporates. Crowns may no longer tumble from royal heads, but governments can still fall, regimes can still unravel, and authority can still vanish with startling speed. Yet these downfalls were not only political events, they were also deeply human dramas. The struggles of monarchs and their families reveal themes as old as storytelling itself: ambition, betrayal, survival, and despair. The ambition to rule, to hold power over millions, lies at the heart of monarchy. For some, like Louis XIV of France or Peter the Great of Russia, ambition led to vast achievements that shaped nations. But for others, ambition proved futile in the face of forces beyond their control. Charles I of Austria may have dreamed of reforming his empire into a federation of equal nations, but the tide of nationalism and the exhaustion of war overwhelmed him. His ambition was noble yet doomed, a tragic echo of the eternal human desire to master circumstances that cannot be mastered. Betrayal is another theme woven into these royal tragedies. Monarchs often trusted courtiers, generals, and even family members, only to find themselves abandoned when the winds shifted. Nicholas II believed in the loyalty of his army, yet by 1917, regiments mutinied, refusing to fire on demonstrators. Louis XVI trusted in noble allies abroad, only to find that foreign monarchs were unwilling to risk their own thrones to save his. The Romanovs discovered that even those charged with guarding them might look the other way when revolutionaries advanced. For rulers who had lived in worlds of deference and obedience, betrayal was not only a political failure, but a profound personal wound, a realization that loyalty was often conditional on the continuation of power. Survival, too, became a central concern once thrones were lost. Monarchs who had never worried about their next meal suddenly found themselves wondering if they would live another day. The French royal family attempted escape, disguising themselves in hopes of reaching the border. The Romanovs prayed for intervention as they moved from palace to prison to house arrest. Charles I clung to the hope of restoration even in exile, making 2 attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne. Some succeeded in surviving exile, living long enough to watch their dynasties fade into memory. Others, like Nicholas and his family, or Louis and Marie Antoinette, paid with their lives. Their stories illustrate that survival, the most basic human instinct, becomes fraught with irony for those who once held absolute authority. The endurance of these themes across centuries speaks to their universality. Whether in Versailles, Vienna, or Ekaterinburg, the struggles of monarchs reflected the same conflicts that ordinary people face in different ways. The desire to hold on to what is cherished, the pain of betrayal, the fight for survival, and the confrontation with mortality. What made the royal tragedies distinct was their scale and visibility. The fall of a monarch was not a private misfortune but a public spectacle, broadcast across continents, shaping the destinies of millions. Yet beneath the crowns and ceremonies, the drama was unmistakably human, echoing the timeless truths of ambition and loss. In reflecting on these stories, one sees how they continue to resonate in modern society. Even in the year 2025, when republics and democracies dominate the political landscape, the fascination with fallen monarchs endures. Films, novels, and historical studies return again and again to their lives, not only to recount events, but to search for meaning. Why do we remain captivated by the image of a king stripped of power or a queen led to the scaffold? Perhaps because these stories remind us of the fragility of all authority and the universality of human struggle. They strip away the illusion that power offers safety and reveal that kings and queens, like all people, are subject to fate, chance, and the will of others. For modern leaders, the lessons are both cautionary and instructive. The monarchs who fell did so not only because of personal failings, but because they misread the needs of their societies. Louis XVI resisted reform until it was too late, unable to see that compromise might have preserved his throne. Nicholas II clung to autocracy even as revolution brewed, failing to adapt to a world that demanded representation and change. Charles I of Austria sought compromise, but his timing and the circumstances of war doomed him. Their fates remind leaders today that authority must evolve, that listening to the governed is not weakness but survival, and that ignoring discontent can turn loyal subjects into rebels overnight. For citizens, the stories of fallen monarchs carry another lesson, that collective action has the power to reshape history. The French Revolution showed that ordinary men and women could topple a monarchy that had endured for centuries. The Russian Revolution proved that even an empire spanning continents could be overturned by workers, soldiers, and peasants united in discontent. These moments remind us that history is not only shaped by rulers but by the governed, and that the will of people, when organized and determined, can upend even the strongest institutions. In the year 2025, the world faces its own challenges: political polarization, economic inequality, climate change, and technological disruption. The stories of fallen monarchs may seem distant, yet they offer insights into the dangers of ignoring discontent, the risks of clinging to outdated forms of authority, and the importance of adaptability. Just as monarchs once believed their crowns eternal, modern institutions sometimes imagine themselves immune to collapse. But history warns otherwise. Fragility lurks beneath the surface of all power, and the lessons of the past echo as warnings for the present. The forgotten kings and queens of history also remind us of the human cost of upheaval. Behind the grand narratives of revolution and war lie personal tragedies. Children growing up in exile, families torn apart, rulers facing imprisonment or execution. Their suffering underscores the price of political transformation and challenges us to pursue change with compassion as well as determination. The drama of their lives teaches that ambition, betrayal, and survival are not only themes of royal downfall, but enduring realities of human society. Thus, the echoes of fallen monarchs reach us still. They remind us that no authority is permanent, that power rests on trust, and that leaders must serve the needs of their people or risk ruin. They remind us that behind the spectacle of crowns and revolutions lies the timeless story of human beings confronting fate. And they remind us that history is not dead but alive, offering lessons for every age, including our own. In the fallen kings of yesterday, we find mirrors for the rulers and citizens of today. Their crowns may lie buried, their palaces turned to museums, but their stories remain, whispering across centuries that power is fragile, that ambition can destroy as easily as it builds, and that survival depends not on wealth or tradition but on the ability to adapt, to listen, and to change. In this way, the tragedies of kings and queens are not relics but living echoes, still speaking to us in 2025, offering both warning and wisdom. Their legacies remind us that every leader, every institution, and every society must reckon with the same truth. Nothing is eternal, and only by understanding the fragility of power can we hope to build a future that endures.